Chapter 2 of A Birding on a Bronco by Florence A. Merriam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Little Lover. On my second visit to California, I spent the winter in the Santa Clara Valley, riding among the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains, where flocks of Oregon robins were resting from the labors of the summer and passing the time until they could fly home again. But when the first spring wildflowers bloomed on the hills, I shipped my little roan mustang by steamer from San Francisco to San Diego, and hurried south to meet him and spend the nesting season in the little valley of the coast mountains, which, 5 years before, had proved such an ideal place to study birds. I went down early in March, to be sure to be in time for the nesting season, but spring was so late that by the last of April hardly a nest had been built, and it seemed as if the birds were never coming back. The weather was gloomy, and the prospect for the spring's work looked discouraging, when one morning I rode over to the line of oaks and sycamores at the mouth of Ugland Canyon I had not visited before. In this dry, treeless region of Southern California, only a little water is needed to cover the bare valley bottoms with verdure. The rushing streams that flow down the canyons after the winter rains fill their mouths with rich groves of brush, oaks, and sycamores, while lines of trees border the streams as far as they extend down the valleys. Before the streams go far, the thirsty soil drinks them up, leaving only dry beds of sand bordered by trees, until the rains of the following winter. In April, the water in this particular canyon mouth had already disappeared, and the wide sand bed under the trees alone remained to tell of the short-lived stream. But the resulting verdure was enough to attract the birds. Apparently, a party of travelers had just arrived. The brush and trees were full of song. Yellowbirds, linnets, chewinks, doves, wrens, and best of all a song sparrow, bless his heart, singing as if he were on a bush in New York State. It was more cheering than anything I had heard in California. When able to listen to something besides song sparrows, I realized that from the trees in front of me was coming the rippling, merry song of a wren. Wrens are always interesting, droll individual little scraps, and having found their nests in sycamore holes before, I let my horse, Mountain Billy, graze nearer to the tree from which the sound came. Before long the small brown pair flew away together across the oat field that spread out from the mouth of the canyon. While they were gone, I took the opportunity to inspect the tree, and found a large hole with twigs sticking out suggestively. Presently, back flew one of the wrens with more building material. But this line of sycamores was off from the highway, and the bird was not used to prying equestrians, so when she found Mountain Billy and me planted in front of her door, she doubted the wisdom of showing us that it was her door. Chattering nervously, she would back and fill, flying all but to the door and then flitting off again. She could not make up her mind to go inside. But soon her mate came and, unmindful of visitors, ardent little lover that he was, sang to her so gaily that it put her in heart, and before I knew it she had slipped into the tree. Here was a nest, at last, right over my eye. To encourage myself while waiting for something to happen, I began a list with the heading Nests, when something caught my eye overhead, and glancing up, behold, a goldfinch walked down a branch and seated herself in a round cup. A few moments later, buzz, whir, a hummingbird flew to a nest among the brown leaves of one of the low-hanging oak sprays, not 10 feet away. I simply stared with delight and astonishment. No need of a list for encouragement now. From Billy's back I could look down into the little cup, which seemed the tiniest in the world. Forgetting the little lover and his mate, I sat still and watched this small household. The young were out of the eggs, though not much more, and their mother sat on the edge of the nest feeding them. She curved her neck over until her long bill stood up perpendicularly, when she put it gently into the gaping bills of her young, the smallest of bills, not more than 1/8 of an inch long, I should judge. I never saw hummingbirds fed so gently. Probably the small bills and throats were so delicate the mother was afraid they would not bear the usual jabbing and pumping. When the little ones were fed, the old bird got down into the nest, fluffing her feathers about her in a pretty motherly way and settling herself comfortably to rest, apparently ignoring the fact that Billy was grazing close beside her. She may have had her qualms, but no mother bird would leave her tender young uncovered on such a cold morning. While she was on the nest, there was an approaching whir, followed by a retreating buzz. Had the father bird started to come to the nest and fled at the sight of me? Remembering the evidence Bradford Torrey collected to prove that the male bird is rarely seen at the nest, I wondered if his absence might be explained by his usually noisy flight, for it would attract the notice of man or beast. 2 days later I carefully touched the tip of my finger to the back of one of the tiny hummingbirds. It was very skinny, I regret to state, and at my touch the little thing opened its wee bill for food. That day the mother fed the birds in the regulation way, when we were only 4 feet distant. I was near enough to see all the horrors of the performance. She thrust her bill down their throats till I felt like crying out, "For mercy's sake, forbear!" She plunged it in up to the very hilt. It seemed as if she must puncture their alimentary canals. While waiting for the wrens, I buckled Billy's bridle around the sycamore and threw myself down on the warm sand under the beautiful tree. The little horse stood near, outlined against the blue sky, with the sunlight dappling his back, while I looked up into the light green foliage of the white sycamore overhead. There seemed to be a great deal of light stored in these delicate trees. The undersides of the big, soft, white leaves looked like white Canton flannel. The sunlight mottled the whitish bark of the trunks and branches, and a great limb arched above me, making a high vaulted chamber whose skylights showed the deep blue above. But there were the little lover and his mate, and I must turn my glass on them. She came first, with long streamers hanging from her bill, and at sight of me got so flustered that one of her straws slipped out and went sailing down to the ground. When the pair had gone again, 2 linnets came along. The female saw the wren's doorway, and being in search of apartments, flew up to look at the house. When she came out, she and her mate talked it over, and apparently she told him something that aroused his curiosity, perhaps about the wren's twigs she found inside, for he flew back into the dark hole and looked around as she had done. Then both birds went off to inspect other holes in the tree. The master of the wren cottage came back in time to see them on their rounds, and taking up his position in front of his door, sang out loudly, with wings hanging and a general air of, "This is my house, I'd have you understand." When the lord of the manor had flown away, his lady came. I thought perhaps he had told her of the visitors, and she had come to see if they had disturbed any of her sticks, for she brought no material. She was afraid to go to the nest in my presence, but flew to a branch near by and leaned down so far it was a wonder she didn't tip over as she stared anxiously at the hole. A bad way to keep a secret, my little lady, I thought. When her merry minstrel came, his song again gave her courage, and she flew inside, turning in the doorway, however, to look out at me. But what with horses grazing under her windows and linnets making free with her nest, the poor wren was unsettled in her mind. Possibly it would be wiser to take out her sticks and build elsewhere. She went about looking at vacant rooms, and examined one opening in the side of the trunk where I could see only her profile as she hung out of the hole. For some time the timid bird would not accept Mountain Billy and me as part of her immediate landscape, and I watched the premises a number of days, getting nothing but my labor for my pains, as far as wrens were concerned. One day when she did not come, I thought it was a good chance to get a study of the hummingbird's nest, but alas, the delicate little structure hung torn and dangling from the twig, with nothing to tell what had become of the poor little hummers. I moralized sadly upon the mutability of human affairs, as I took the tattered nest and tied it up in a corner of my handkerchief, for it was all that was left of the little home built with such exquisite care and brooded over so tenderly. The yellowbird's nest came to an untimely end too, although its start was such a bright one. It was a disappointment, for the goldfinches are such trustful birds and so affectionate and tender in their family relations that they always win one's warm interest. At first, when this mother bird went to the nest, her mate stationed himself on the nest tree, leaning over and looking down anxiously at Billy and me. But before their home was broken up, the watchful guardian fed his pretty mate at her brooding while we were below. We had a great many visitors while waiting for the wrens. Neighbors came to sit in our green shade, young housekeepers came looking for rooms to rent, and old birds who were leading around their noisy families came to dine with us. Once a pair of flickers started to light in the tree, but they gave a glance over the shoulder at me and fled. Later I found their secret, down inside an old charred stump up the canyon.